Hey Nature Detectives, I'm Conrad. I'm an outdoor educator with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation at Letchworth State Park, and today I have a nature mystery for you. I don't know if you've been following Letchworth State Park's social media over the past couple of weeks, but we've been getting a lot of rain. That means that the falls are super active, and the river's nice and high, and the rapids are all going, but it also means that there is terrific fruiting of mushrooms in western New York. Not just in Letchworth State Park, but all across western New York, we are seeing lots and lots of mushrooms popping up out of the ground, shooting out of tree stumps, and seemingly coming out of thin air in some places. The closer you look, the more you'll see. And I wonder if your neighborhood isn't bursting with mushrooms this time of year as well. At this spot, I see lots of different kinds of mushrooms. I'm going to focus on this bigger one that I see down here at my feet. I think we can use a couple of clues to get us closer to what kind of mushroom this is. It is not surprising to me in the least that I have no idea what kind of mushroom this is. There are lots of different kinds of mushrooms and fungi that look extremely similar to each other. There are literally thousands of species of them, and some of them look so close to each other that you need to use some extra advanced nature tools to be able to tell them apart. I am here to give you those advanced nature tools so that you can identify mushrooms on your nature adventures. This kind of mushroom is a classic kind of toadstool shape with a stem coming up out of the ground and then opening up into a kind of an umbrella. Keep in mind that not all fungi will have that sort of body type, but some of them will be like a mold, like almost like a crust. Some of them will be kind of like a bumpy slime or a jelly. Some of them will be like a big ball or a lump, like a giant puff ball. And many of them will indeed pop right up out of the ground like a little toadstool. If you have a toadstool type mushroom, it will begin its life as a little egg-like ball underneath its substrate. Now the substrate is what this mushroom is living in. The actual living organism, the fungus, is underneath the substrate or in the substrate. It'll be rotting wood or soil, or sometimes the roots of trees will offer nutrition to different kinds of fungi. Whatever the fungus is actually living in, the organism of the fungus will be spread through that substrate in sometimes kind of a clear root-like looking substance called mycelium. The mycelium is the living, continually reproducing part of the mushroom. When it comes time for them to reproduce and make more of themselves, have their babies, they send out these mushrooms. These are the fruiting bodies of the fungus. Picking this mushroom right here does not kill the fungus because the real organism is living under the dirt. It's the exact same effect as picking a flower from a bush or a tree. The real living organism is intact, but just the fruit has been picked. Now don't forget that we can only collect mushrooms where we have permission to collect mushrooms, not in state parks like Letchworth. If you have some mushrooms coming out of your lawn or in some woods in your backyard, or if you have permission to collect mushrooms in someone else's yard or someone else's woods, then you're in business. If you're trying to identify one of these toadstool type mushrooms, the first thing that I look at is the color and the texture of the top of the mushroom. Some mushrooms are very smooth and plain like this one, but some of them have really exciting nature clues going on up there. Some of them are really dark in the middle and light on the rim. That's important to notice. Some of them have little bumps, what look like little scabs or warts on the top, and those are kind of funky. Sometimes those scabs and warts are chunks of that original egg, that original vulva that's inside the substrate. As the mushroom bursts up as a tiny little button on the end of that stalk and eventually starts to open up, little pieces of that original egg-like structure will stick to the top of the mushroom and will stay there all throughout the end of that fruiting period of that mushroom. The second nature clue that I use to identify a toadstool type mushroom is by looking underneath. Gotta look underneath. Don't forget to turn those mushrooms over. Underneath this one, you'll notice that there are some little lines underneath. And those lines are really like little ditches. And those ditches have a lot of surface area. A lot of this underside of that mushroom is exposed to the air. And those surfaces are releasing spores. The spores are those tiny little seed-like structures that float across the forest floor and land and make baby mushrooms when they find the right substrate. Those gills can sometimes be unique to a group of mushrooms and sometimes can set a mushroom apart from a whole other different kind of mushroom that is not even that closely related. Some mushrooms spread their spores through little holes, little pores underneath. They look like tiny little pockmarks, like someone took a pin and just poked thousands of tiny holes on the bottom of the mushroom. Some mushrooms almost look completely flat and plain, like corkboard, because their pores are so tiny that our human eyes can't even see them. Some mushrooms have lots and lots of tiny gills packed closely together. Some mushrooms have very few gills that are spaced far apart. And some mushrooms have gills that extend all the way into the middle of the cap and down the stalk a little ways, and some mushrooms have gills that stop short of the stem or that just go to the very edge of the stem and then stop cleanly with a nice ring around the stem. Those are all really important nature clues to tell different kinds of mushrooms apart. Those structures are helping to spread the spores of the mushrooms through the forests. Different species of mushrooms have different techniques for spreading different kinds of spores. And that brings me to the last, and in my opinion, the very coolest way of telling different kinds of mushrooms apart is by taking a spore print. You remember that spores are too small to see with our human eyes. Well, what if we were to put a mushroom like this flat on a piece of paper and leave it there overnight? Millions of tiny spores would fall out of this mushroom onto that piece of paper. Just a few would be invisible, but if you leave it there all night, you'll have enough spores that you'll be able to see the color of those spores, and if it's really undisturbed and not moved all night long for hours and hours, you'll be able to see the pattern of the gills in the spore print. That is a super duper advanced mycological study of mushrooms method for telling different kinds of mushrooms apart. It's one of my very, very favorites. Not only is it really scientifically relevant and interesting and important to tell different mushrooms apart, but it's also really beautiful artwork. If you really want to put your nature detective skills to the test, go make a spore print from a toadstool-type mushroom from your neighborhood. Finding the mushroom is the easy part. Sometimes they'll bust up right out of the lawn in some places. But you have to put the mushroom face down, gill side down or pore side down on some construction paper or paper bag paper. I like to use paper bags because they're brown, so they'll show very light color spores and very dark color spores and everything in between. Sometimes you'll get really exciting, fun colors like yellow or orange or red. It's one of the most important nature clues that mycologists who study mushrooms use to tell different kinds of look-alike mushrooms apart. Now, obviously, the question that many of us are going to have about this is it okay for me to handle a potentially toxic, poisonous mushroom with my bare skin? The answer that I've found across every mycological resource that I've found on this topic is yes. There is no problem with you handling even an intensely toxic mushroom with your fingers, as long as you wash your hands afterward. That sounds like a pretty fair deal to me. I'll absolutely wash my hands after handling this mystery mushroom. The spores can't hurt us. The juices on mushrooms can't hurt us. If there's any like slime or goo sometimes on some really fun kinds of mushrooms, that can't hurt us. The problem is if we put it in our mouths and eat some mushrooms that we find in the woods. I will never recommend that you eat mushrooms that you find in the woods because there's always that chance that it's going to be a really nasty look-alike to something that looks totally edible but really is not. And we could get hurt that way. So safety first, don't eat any mushrooms you find in the woods, but explore to your heart's content. Go make some spore prints and go on to an online resource like a mushroom finder, or get a mushroom field guide. I've had a lot of fun going through mushroom field guides and comparing, oh, these two mushrooms look really similar, but this one has a light colored spore print and this one has a dark colored spore print. It can be a really rewarding and fun and artistic way to figure out what you are looking at when you're out in the woods after a nice hard rain. Well, thank you so much for joining me for today's Nature Mystery. If you have any questions about spore prints or toadstool mushrooms, please put a question in the comment section below the video. Share this video with your friends to put their nature detective skills to the test. And as always, like Letchworth State Park's Facebook page to stay tuned for more nature mysteries.